Welcome to Revenge Blaze, the channel, dedicated to gripping tales of betrayal, revenge, and ultimate justice in dramatic storytelling form. If you're new here, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. You won't want to miss what's coming next. We've got even more intense, satisfying stories lined up that will keep you hooked. Thank you so much for joining us today. Let's dive right in, without delay. The Heiress's Reckoning, a tale of stolen legacy and sweet justice. My name is Reese Vaughn. 20 years ago, I watched this empire burn from the back of a social services van. Today, I stood at the iron gates of Vaughn Estates in Napa Valley, not as a victim, but as a silent ghost haunting the family that thought they had buried me. The air was thick with the scent of fermenting grapes and betrayal. I walked into the main house expecting the warmth of a Thanksgiving homecoming, but the grand foyer was a tomb of silence. No laughter, no clinking glasses, only the hollow echo of my own footsteps on the marble floor. On the mahogany console sat a single cream-colored envelope. I tore it open, my hands steady despite the fire raging in my chest. It was from Graham. Gone to the Caribbean with the ex. Mom needed a getaway from the stress. You stay here and deal with the old man. He's fading fast and needs constant monitoring. Don't call unless he stops breathing. See you Monday. B. The words were a slap in the face, a calculated insult from the man I had spent 5 years loving just to get back into this house. They had taken my father's legacy, turned my mother into a ghost, roaming these halls as a servant, and now they thought they could discard me like a common maid while they toasted to their stolen wealth on a cruise ship. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. A cold, sharp clarity settled over me. I turned toward the heavy oak door leading to the cellar. The temperature dropped as I descended into the darkness of the Vaughn family's greatest secrets. There, sitting in a high-backed leather chair amidst thousands of dusty bottles, was Remington, the man who had orchestrated my father's ruin. He looked frail, his skin like parchment, but when he opened one eye, the predatory gleam was still there. He looked at me, really looked at me, as if he finally saw the 8-year-old girl he had cast out 20 years ago. He didn't ask where his son was. He didn't ask for water. He gripped the arms of his chair, leaned forward with a raspy breath, and whispered, "Shall we begin?" I nodded, the weight of 2 decades of planning finally coming to a head. 4 days later, my husband would be on his knees begging for a mercy I no longer possessed. The true heir has returned to reclaim every stolen breath. If you believe that a debt of 20 years must be paid in full, hit that subscribe button, ring the bell, and join our journey of ultimate justice. Don't let the traitors win. Subscribe now to see the empire fall. The morning mist clung to the rolling hills of Napa Valley like a heavy shroud, obscuring the lush vines that had once been my father's pride. I moved through the kitchen of the main house with practiced silence, preparing a tray of simple broth and dry toast. My mind was a whirlwind of the previous night's encounter with Remington Vaughn. The "shall we begin?" he whispered wasn't just a question, it was an invitation to a dance with the devil himself. I carried the tray toward the back of the estate, past the manicured gardens, to a small weathered cottage near the equipment shed, a place the family called the staff quarters, but which I knew as a prison. Inside, the air was cool and smelled of lavender and damp earth. A woman stood by the window, her back to me, her silver-streaked hair tied in a neat, humble bun. Clara, the woman who gave me life, stood there like a shadow of the vibrant mother I remembered. When she heard my footsteps, she didn't turn with a smile. She turned with the flinch of someone who expected a reprimand. When our eyes met for a split second, the mask of a servant slipped, revealing a depth of agony that nearly broke my resolve. "I brought you some breakfast," I said, my voice intentionally neutral for any prying ears, though we were alone. She nodded, her hands trembling as she took a bowl. For 20 years she had survived in this gilded cage, forced to maintain the very vines that Remington had stolen from us all to ensure my safety while I was growing up in the system. Seeing her like this, a ghost in her own home, fueled a surgical rage inside me that no cruise ship vacation could ever dampen. I left her with a whispered promise of soon and returned to the main house, heading straight for the study where the Vaughn family's most private records were kept. Graham, my husband in name, only had always been careless with his digital footprint, assuming my background in accounting was just a tool for his convenience. I sat at the mahogany desk, the very one my father used to sit at while teaching me the value of integrity, and pulled up the medical portal for Remington's palliative care. My eyes scanned the logs, and what I found made my blood run cold. Graham had been playing a dangerous game with his father's life. Official oncologist reports showed a specific regimen of pain management and enzymes, but internal pharmacy logs revealed 3 adjustments he had made over the last month, systematically reducing vital medications while doubling sedatives. It wasn't neglect. It was a calculated attempt to accelerate the end. My husband wasn't just a traitor to me. He was circling his own father like a vulture, waiting for the old man to stop breathing so he could claim a throne he hadn't earned. He wanted the estate before the holidays ended. A notification chimed on my laptop from our joint high-yield savings account. I clicked, expecting routine interest. Instead, I stared at a withdrawal that stole the air from my lungs. $200,000 gone, time-stamped 48 hours ago, as Graham boarded that ship. That money was the capital I had gathered to secure a future for my mother once we escaped. Tracking the spend through his linked private credit card revealed the Trail Luxury Suite upgrade, a $10,000 diamond pendant from the ship's boutique, and private excursions in the Cayman Islands. He wasn't on a simple getaway. He was parading my mother's freedom and my father's legacy in front of a woman who likely knew nothing of the theft behind his name. I leaned back, a grim smile touching my lips. Graham thought he was clever, leaving me with a dying man and an empty house. He didn't realize that by leaving me with Remington, he had handed me the keys to the kingdom. He had forgotten the one thing more valuable than gold: information. I looked out at the vines, rows like soldiers awaiting command. Remington knew where the skeletons were buried. He had dug the graves. In his greed, Graham had pushed the old man into a corner. And a cornered wolf, even an old one, still has teeth. I closed the laptop, my plan shifting from escape to total reclamation. Graham was sipping champagne bought with my mother's tears, thinking he had won. He had no idea that back in Napa's chilly fog, the wife he dismissed as a servant was preparing a reckoning that would leave him with nothing but salt water in his lungs. I smoothed my skirts, and headed back to the cellar. A legal battle awaited, and my first witness was ready for his next dose of reality. California high society loved a scandal, but they were about to witness something far more decisive. As I walked, I recalled a remark Remington had made years ago. Graham had the brains of a cork and the ego of a vintage bottle. It was true. My husband had underestimated the one person he should have feared most. He thought he left me to be a caretaker, but he actually left me to be the executioner of his inheritance. The stone walls of the underground cellar felt like the inner sanctum of a fortress holding 20 years of silence and cold Napa earth. I descended the spiral staircase, the air thick with oak and ancient secrets. Remington sat exactly where I had left him, skeletal yet sharp-eyed. I placed the medical folder on the tasting table, Graham's lethal tampering glaring under the dim amber light. "He's not waiting for nature to take its course, Remington," I said, my voice echoing off the vaulted ceiling. "Your son is trading your remaining days for a faster route to the probate court." Remington let out a dry, rasping chuckle that sounded like dead leaves skittering on pavement. He didn't look surprised. In this family, betrayal was as common as the harvest, and he had been the one to plant the first seeds. He reached out a trembling hand toward a specific bottle of Cabernet on the rack behind him, not to drink, but to use as a lever. With a subtle metallic click, a section of the stone wall recessed and slid aside, revealing a small climate-controlled alcove that appeared on no architectural plans of the estate. Inside lay a series of leather-bound ledgers and a heavy steel lockbox. Remington's voice was a ghost of its former power as he spoke. Your father Thomas was a dreamer, Reese. He believed in the soil, but he didn't understand the vultures circling it. 20 years ago, I didn't just witness his ruin, I engineered it. The admission hung in the air like a poisonous fog. He detailed the shadow companies, the forged debt notices, and the orchestrated bank foreclosures that had stripped my mother and me of everything in 48 hours. I thought I could manage the empire better, he whispered, his gaze dropping to his gnarled hands. But I raised a son who has the appetite of a shark and the loyalty of a snake. Graham is the punishment for my sins, but he doesn't have to be yours. He pointed toward the lockbox. Inside were the original unrecorded deeds to the northwestern acreage of the Valley land that had never been legally part of the Vaughn Estates merger. It was the heart of my father's legacy, still legally mine if I had the courage to claim it. As I reached for the box, the sharp, upbeat ringtone of my phone shattered the solemnity of the vault. I glanced at the screen. It was a video call from Graham. I signaled Remington to remain silent and answered the bright Caribbean sun on the screen, contrasting sharply with our subterranean gloom. Graham appeared on the deck of a sun-drenched yacht, a glass of vintage champagne in one hand, and his arm draped around a blonde woman who was laughing at something the bartender had said. He looked tanned, relaxed, and utterly devoid of a conscience. "Hey, honey," he mocked, his voice dripping with condescension. "How's the purgatory treating you? Is the old man still rattling his chains, or has he finally done us a favor and gone quiet?" Behind him, I could see his mother Elaine adjusting her designer sunglasses while a waiter brought her another cocktail. They looked like royalty on a victory lap, celebrating a wealth they had stolen from a dying man and an orphan. "He's resting, Graham," I replied, my face a mask of weary devotion. "The house is very quiet. It's a lot of work managing his medications and keeping the estate running while you're away." Graham let out a loud, arrogant laugh that made the blonde woman lean in closer. "That's what you're there for, Reese. You were always so good at the domestic stuff, the invisible work. Just keep him comfortable until Monday. If he kicks the bucket before we get back, just call the funeral home and tell them to put him on ice. I don't want a dead body ruining Mom's tan when we dock." He leaned into the camera, his smile turning cruel. "And don't worry about the savings account. Consider that withdrawal a stress relief fee for having to deal with your depressing face for 5 years. Be a good girl and mop the floors, okay, Chow?" The screen went black, leaving the seller in an even deeper silence than before. The sheer audacity of his cruelty was almost humorous in its perfection. Graham truly believed I was a broken woman trapped in a role of service while he spent my future on a floating palace. I looked back at Remington, who had watched the entire exchange. A flicker of genuine disgust crossed the old man's face. "He always was a clumsy villain," Remington muttered. "He thinks he has the world in his pocket, but he's forgotten that I still hold the receipt for his soul." Remington then revealed the final piece of the puzzle. The secret cellar wasn't just for deeds. It contained a second set of books, the true financial records of the Vaughn conglomerate. For years, Remington had been documenting Graham's embezzlement from the corporate tax accounts, a secret insurance policy the old man had kept to ensure his son never grew too powerful to control. "I was saving these to keep him under my thumb," Remington said, pushing the heavy ledgers toward me. "But I'm out of time and I'm out of thumbs. Take them. Turn his new beginning into a final ending." I ran my fingers over the cold leather of the ledgers. The evidence in this room was enough to dismantle the Vaughn name and rebuild my father's empire from the ashes. I wasn't just a caretaker anymore. I was an architect of a catastrophe. Graham thought he had left me in the dark, but he had actually left me in the one place where the light of truth was most blinding. I looked at the old man, this unlikely ally who had once been my greatest enemy. We were two discarded souls united by the common thread of a man who thought we were both too weak to fight back. "I'll need a lawyer," I said, my voice as cold as the stone around us. "A very expensive, very aggressive lawyer." Remington nodded, a grim, satisfied smile touching his pale lips. I have just the one. She owes me a favor from 1998, and she hates men like my son. As I began to organize the documents, a strange sense of peace settled over me. Graham was paying for the very cruise ship trip that was giving me the time and space to destroy him. He was literally funding his own downfall while laughing at the woman who was making it happen. The glow of the dual monitors in the study was the only light in the house as the clock struck 2 in the morning. While the rest of Napa Valley slept, I was deep within the digital entrails of Vaughn Estates. My fingers danced across the keyboard, utilizing the forensic auditing software I had spent years mastering for this exact moment. Graham always joked that my obsession with spreadsheets was adorable, never realizing that I was cataloging every penny he stole while he was busy deciding which silk tie matched his unearned arrogance. I wasn't just looking for mistakes. I was building a paper trail, and Graham was handing me the rope. I began by cross-referencing the secret ledgers Remington had provided with the official company filings. The discrepancies were staggering. Under the guise of vineyard maintenance and consultation fees, Graham had been funneling massive amounts of capital out of the conglomerate. I tracked a series of wire transfers each for exactly $49,000 to stay just under the federal reporting threshold, leading directly to a shell corporation registered in Delaware. From there, the money cascaded into a private account belonging to a woman named Bianca, the very same blonde colleague currently sipping my savings on that cruise ship. He had moved over $400,000 in the last 6 months alone, essentially gutting the company's emergency reserves to fund a lifestyle of champagne and infidelity. As I compiled the evidence, Graham thought he was a criminal mastermind because he knew how to use a VPN, but he had left a trail of digital breadcrumbs that a first-year intern could follow. I exported the final report into an encrypted drive, feeling a surge of cold satisfaction. Every dinner he missed, every late night at the office he lied about, was now a line item on a criminal indictment. I was no longer just a victim of his betrayal. I was the auditor of his downfall. The following afternoon, a heavy knock at the front door interrupted my work. I opened it to find Arthur Sterling, the owner of the massive vineyard directly across the valley. Arthur was a man of 70 with skin like tanned leather and eyes that had seen every vintage since the 1960s. He stood there holding a basket of late-season pears, but his expression was far from neighborly. "Reese," he began, his voice a gravelly rumble. "I came by to check on Remington, but mostly I came to see if you've lost your damn minds." I invited him into the foyer, sensing the shift in the air. Arthur didn't waste time with pleasantries. He leaned heavily on his cane, gesturing toward the northwestern ridge of the estate. "I had a meeting with a representative from Global Viticulture last week. They told me the deal for Vaughn Estates was almost finalized. They said Graham had already signed the letter of intent to sell the entire northern acreage, the heart of your father's original land." My heart skipped a beat, though I kept my face impassive. "Remington hasn't authorized a sale, Arthur," I stated firmly. The old man let out a cynical snort. "That's what I told them. But Graham told them his father was mentally incapacitated and that he was the sole decision-maker now. He's trying to liquidate the legacy behind your backs, Reese. He's selling the soul of this valley for a quick payout to some corporate suit in San Francisco." The audacity of it was breathtaking. Graham wasn't just stealing cash, he was trying to erase the very ground we stood on. Selling that land to a conglomerate meant the end of the Vaughn legacy, a final insult to my father's memory. Arthur looked at me with a mix of pity and frustration. "Graham's a fool girl. He thinks a vineyard is just a line on a balance sheet. He doesn't realize that if he sells to those vultures, he'll never be able to show his face in this county again. Is Remington really as far gone as he says?" I shook my head, a plan already forming. "Remington is more alert than he's been in years, Arthur. And he's going to be very interested to hear about this mental incapacity." After Arthur left his warning ringing in my ears, I headed down to the cellar. I found Remington reviewing some old maps looking remarkably stronger despite his diagnosis. I told him about Arthur's visit and Graham's secret negotiations with global viticulture. The transformation in the old man was terrifying. The frailty seemed to vanish, replaced by the ruthless tycoon who had once ruled the valley with an iron fist. "He's selling Thomas's land," Remington whispered, his voice trembling with a lethal quiet. "He's trying to bury me while I'm still breathing. That boy has no respect for the harvest. He thinks he can sign away 20 years of labor for a few zeros on a check." Remington stood up, leaning on the tasting table for support. "He's forgotten who taught him how to bite. We aren't just going to stop the sale, Reese. We are going to make sure that global viticulture wouldn't touch him with a 10-foot pole. Graham wants to play the incapacity card. Fine. We'll show them exactly how capable I still am." He reached for a dusty telephone on the wall, one that bypassed the house's main line. "Call the Boston office. Tell them the chairman is calling a special emergency session of the board. And Reese, make sure your paper empire is ready to be presented. I want every dollar, every cent, and every lie laid out on that table." I looked at the man who had ruined my life 2 decades ago, and for the first time I saw a reflection of my own resolve. We were a strange pair, the thief and the orphan, united by a mutual hatred for a man who had no honor. Graham was currently on a yacht, probably laughing about how he was going to be a multimillionaire by the time he docked. He had no idea that his depressing wife and his dying father were currently sharpening the blades. I spent the next few hours meticulously organizing the evidence into a presentation that would not only prove his embezzlement, but also void any legal standing he had to sell the land. By the time I was finished, I had a digital and physical trail that led directly to a jail cell. Graham thought he was selling our future, but he was actually just providing the evidence for his own eviction. The rain began as a soft whisper against the study windows before turning into a relentless downpour that masked the sound of a dark sedan pulling into the gravel driveway. It was nearly midnight. I opened the side door to admit Patricia Winters, a woman whose reputation in California legal circles was as formidable as the vintage wines aging in our cellar. She didn't offer a greeting. She simply shook the water from her charcoal trench coat and placed a heavy briefcase on the oak table. Her eyes, sharp and unyielding behind silver-rimmed glasses, flicked to the staircase. "Is he ready?" she asked, her voice a low professional rasp. I nodded, leading her toward the master suite where Remington waited. The atmosphere in the room was heavy with the scent of antiseptic and old paper. Remington sat propped up by pillows, the sheer effort of staying upright visible in the rhythmic trembling of his hands. However, the clarity in his gaze was terrifying. He looked like a man who had finally shed the burden of pretense. Patricia wasted no time spreading a mountain of legal documents across the bedspread: irrevocable trust agreements, asset transfer deeds, and a revised last will and testament that would effectively erase Graham from the family's financial history. "You understand the implications, Remington?" Patricia asked, her fountain pen poised. "By placing everything into the Vaughn Legacy Trust with Reese as the sole trustee, you are stripping your son of any legal standing to contest the estate. You are essentially making him a stranger to your wealth." Remington's signature was a jagged, desperate line, but it was legally binding. One by one, the properties, the offshore accounts, and the controlling shares of the conglomerate were moved into a digital fortress that only I held the keys to. Graham was currently on a yacht named the Sovereign, yet he had just become the most powerless man in the state of California. He thought I was home doing the laundry. He didn't realize I was currently inheriting his world. As the final document was notarized, Patricia turned to me with a look of grim respect. "It's done, Reese. Legally, the empire is yours. But remember, the moment he docks, he will come for you with everything he has. You need to be ready to stand your ground." Just as Patricia packed her briefcase to leave, the monitor beside Remington's bed began to emit a frantic, high-pitched wail. His breathing became a series of ragged, desperate gasps, and his face took on a gray, ashen hue that I recognized all too well from my father's final hours. The theatrical decline we had planned for the cameras had suddenly become a brutal reality. Remington reached out his gnarled fingers, clutching my forearm with a strength that shouldn't have been possible. No. Hospitals? He wheezed, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and absolute command. The promise, Reese. Don't let them turn me into a vegetable for the lawyers to feast on. Let me go. In my house. My soil. I stood frozen, the phone in my hand, already displaying the digits for 911. Every instinct in my modern law-abiding brain told me to call for an ambulance, to let the flashing lights and the sirens take over. But then I looked at the man who had been my enemy and had become my only ally. If I called the paramedics, the house would be swarmed. Graham would be notified by the authorities immediately. The delicate legal transition we had just completed could be challenged under the claim that Remington was under medical duress. More importantly, I had looked into this man's eyes and promised him dignity, something his own son had tried to steal with diluted medications and a cruise ship ticket. "Patricia, wait," I whispered, my voice shaking. The lawyer paused at the door, her expression unreadable. I looked at the monitor, then back at the man who had once ruined my life. I made a choice that had nothing to do with revenge and everything to do with the harvest. I put the phone down. I moved to the bedside and took Remington's hand, feeling the rapid, fading pulse. I began to talk to him not about the stocks or the deeds, but about the valley. I spoke of the harvest of 1998, the year the grapes were perfect, and the way the sun looked hitting the northern ridge before the vultures arrived. I told him that Clara was safe, that the land would never be sold to global viticulture, and that the Vaughn name would finally mean something honorable again. The minutes stretched into an eternity of shadows. Remington's grip slowly loosened, his breathing slowing to a calm, rhythmic sigh. He looked toward the window as if he could see the vines through the darkness and the rain. A faint, tired smile touched his lips, perhaps, at the thought of the look on Graham's face, when he realized he had been outplayed by an old man and a boring wife. Boring. In those final moments, there was no anger, only the quiet settling of a long overdue debt. He slipped away, not as a victim of Graham's neglect, but as the master of his own exit. By 3 a.m, the house was silent once more. Patricia had left to secure the filings, and I sat alone in the dim light of the foyer. I felt a strange, hollow lightness. The legal battle hadn't even truly begun, but the war for the soul of the estate was over. Graham was likely still asleep in his luxury cabin, dreaming of the millions he was going to make from selling the northern acreage. He had no idea that the man he called a burden was gone, and the woman he called honey was now his landlord. I looked at the ring on my finger, a piece of gold that felt like a lead weight. I removed it, placing it on the console beside the empty glass of port Remington had enjoyed earlier that week. The reckoning was coming, and for the first time in 20 years, I wasn't afraid of the storm. The pre-dawn light of Saturday filtered through the heavy velvet curtains, casting long skeletal shadows across the master suite of Vaughn Estates. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the faint rhythmic ticking of a grandfather clock in the hallway. Remington Vaughn lay perfectly still, his battle with the vultures of his own blood finally over. He had passed away just before 4 a.m, his hand resting in mine, his final gaze fixed on the window overlooking the vines. There was a profound, bittersweet dignity in the way he left, not in a cold hospital ward surrounded by beeping machines, but in the heart of the empire he had stolen, then sought to return. I stood up, my joints stiff from the night-long vigil, and opened the bedroom door. Clara was standing in the hallway, her shadow stretching long against the floral wallpaper. For the first time in 2 decades, I reached out and took my mother's hand, leading her across the threshold of the master suite. She stepped onto the plush Persian rug with a hesitation that broke my heart, a woman entering a sanctuary she had been forbidden to touch while serving as its invisible ghost. We stood by Remington's bed in silence. Clara didn't weep. She simply placed a weathered hand on the old man's forehead, a silent gesture of forgiveness for the man who had ruined our lives, yet chose us as his final witnesses. In that moment, the hierarchy of the Vaughn household collapsed. The maid was now the mistress of the house, and the master was merely dust. I knew I had to move quickly. The Reaper had arrived, but the vultures were still circling in the Caribbean, oblivious to the fact that their prey had already escaped. I spent the next 2 hours orchestrating a masterpiece of deception. I carefully arranged the room to look as though a long, arduous medical battle was still ongoing. I left the discarded vials of sedatives on the nightstand and draped a warm blanket over Remington's legs, making him appear as if he were merely in a deep medicated sleep should any unsuspecting neighbor peer through the glass. By 6 in the morning, the house was a stage set for a play that would only end in a courtroom. I sat at the kitchen island, the cold granite chilling my palms, and picked up my phone. It was time to feed the beast. I opened my message thread with Graham. He had sent a photo an hour earlier, a blurry shot of a sunrise over the ocean captioned, "Living the dream. Hope the old man isn't being too much of a pain. Drink a glass of water for me." The sheer, unadulterated arrogance of the message made my stomach churn. He truly thought he was untouchable, a king in waiting, enjoying a vacation funded by the very man he was killing. I typed out a reply with surgical precision. "Everything is stable here, Graham. He's had a very quiet night, sleeping more than usual. The nurse says his breathing is shallow but consistent. Take your time coming back on Monday. He doesn't even know what day it is. Enjoy the breakfast buffet." I hit send, watching the small blue bubble disappear into the digital ether. It was a Trojan horse of a text message designed to keep him exactly where he was, miles away from the legal storm Patricia Winters was currently brewing in San Francisco. If Graham suspected even for a second that his father was gone, he would be on the first private flight back, likely with a team of lawyers to contest the trust documents we had signed only hours before. By keeping him in the sun, I was keeping him in the dark. Throughout the morning, I moved through the house with a cold, focused energy. I coordinated with the funeral home Patricia had recommended, ensuring they arrived in an unmarked van and used the service entrance. Two somber men in dark suits handled Remington's body with a respect his own son had never shown him. As they drove away, the house felt strangely lighter, as if a great oppressive weight had been lifted from the foundation. I returned to the study and began the final preparations for the reception Graham and his mother would receive upon their return. I printed out the forensic audit reports, the land deeds, and the digital logs of Graham's medical tampering, placing them in gold-embossed folders that looked like official invitations. I took a moment to look at myself in the foyer mirror. The woman staring back wasn't the tired, compliant wife Graham had left behind. My eyes were sharp, my posture regal. I was the daughter of Thomas Vaughn, and I was finally home. I noticed a small, dusty bottle of port on the console, the one Remington had mentioned earlier. I poured 2 small glasses, handed one to my mother, and we stood in the center of the grand foyer. "To the harvest, Mom," I whispered. Clara clinked her glass against mine, a small knowing smile touching her lips. We weren't just waiting for a husband and a mother-in-law to return. We were waiting for the execution of a 20-year sentence. The late afternoon sun began to dip behind the northern ridge, casting the vineyard in a golden, deceptive peace. From the outside, Vaughn Estates looked like the picture-perfect image of California success. Inside, it was a minefield. I checked my bank app one last time. The $200,000 Graham had stolen was a drop in the bucket compared to the millions he was about to lose. Every time my phone pinged with a notification from Graham's Instagram, another photo of him and Bianca at a beach club, I just smiled. Every cocktail they ordered was another nail in his financial coffin. As the shadows lengthened, I realized that the hardest part wasn't the revenge, it was the waiting. I had to maintain the facade for another 48 hours, acting the part of the dutiful, overwhelmed wife, while my mother lived like a queen in the shadows of the house. I had spent 5 years being Graham's shadow, learning his habits, his fears, and his weaknesses. He thought he knew me, but he had never even seen me. He had only seen the reflection of his own ego. Monday was coming, and with it a gale-force wind that would blow the Vaughn name right off the gate. I walked to the front door, turned the deadbolt, and felt a sense of calm I hadn't known since I was 8 years old. The trap was set, the bait was taken, and the hunter was finally ready. Monday afternoon arrived with a crisp, biting wind that swept through the Napa Valley, rattling the dried leaves on the vines like a warning. I sat in the grand study positioned behind the massive mahogany desk that had belonged to the Vaughn patriarchs for generations. Beside me, Patricia Winters sat with her spine like a steel rod, her briefcase open to reveal the legal equivalent of a firing squad. Two Napa County Sheriff's deputies stood discreetly in the foyer, their presence a silent looming shadow. The house was no longer a tomb, it was a courtroom, and the defendants were just pulling into the driveway. The sound of slamming car doors and boisterous laughter shattered the silence of the estate. I watched through the window as Graham, his mother Elaine, and the blonde woman Bianca piled out of a luxury SUV. They were laden with duty-free shopping bags, gold foil boxes from St. Kitts designer boutique bags from the ship's promenade, and tacky souvenirs. They looked sunburned, pampered, and disgustingly cheerful. Graham was wearing a brand new linen shirt probably bought with the interest from the $200,000 he had stolen from me. He was regaling Bianca with a story, gesturing broadly at the house as if he were showing a tourist his private kingdom. "Honey, we're home." Graham's voice boomed as the front door swung open. "The cruise was a dream, but wait until you see the pearls I got for you. Well, mostly for Bianca, but you get a souvenir too." His laughter died in his throat the moment he stepped into the foyer. He froze, his eyes darting from the uniformed deputies to the closed study doors. Elaine followed behind him, dropping her Gucci handbag on the console table with a confused frown. "What on earth is going on? Why are there police in my house?" she demanded, her voice rising to that familiar shrill pitch of entitlement. I stood up slowly and walked to the study door, leaning against the frame, with a calmness that seemed to unnerve them more than any scream could. "It's not your house, Elaine," I said, my voice as cold as a winter harvest. "And you're just in time for the reckoning." Graham tried to regain his composure, stepping forward with a forced, arrogant smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Reese, stop the drama. Did the old man finally kick the bucket? Is that why the cops are here? Look, I know you're stressed from playing nurse, but let's be civilized in front of our guest." He gestured vaguely toward Bianca, who was now looking increasingly uncomfortable, clutching a shopping bag, as if it were a shield. "Remington passed away on Saturday, Graham," I stated flatly. For a second, a flash of genuine relief crossed Graham's face, the look of a vulture who had finally seen the carcass stop moving. "Well, that's tragic," he said, barely hiding his smirk. "A real loss. But since I'm the next of kin, I'll take it from here. Officers, you can go. My wife is just a bit overwhelmed with grief." Patricia Winters stepped forward, then her heels clicking on the marble like a death knell. "Actually, Mr. Vaughn, you are no longer anyone's kin in this house. My name is Patricia Winters, and I am the executor of the Vaughn Legacy Trust." Graham's face cycled through confusion, denial, and finally a simmering rage. What trust? My father was a vegetable. He couldn't sign a grocery list, let alone a trust. I stepped back into the study and gestured for them to enter. They had spent a week toasting to a future that had been legally dismantled while they were at the buffet. I pressed play on the large monitor on the wall. Remington's face filled the screen, alert, lucid, and devastatingly articulate. The video testimony played, detailing Graham's medical neglect, the tampering with the prescriptions, and the documented embezzlement. As the video reached the part where Remington explicitly disinherited Graham for calculated abandonment and financial cruelty, Elaine let out a strangled gasp. "This is a setup. You manipulated a dying man," she shrieked, turning her fury on me. "You're a gold digger who crawled her way into this family." I didn't flinch. I simply handed a folder to the lead deputy. "Graham Vaughn." The officer began, his voice echoing in the crowded room. "I am serving you with an immediate vacate order. This property is now the legal asset of the Vaughn Legacy Trust, and the trustee Reese Vaughn has revoked your right of residency. Furthermore, there is an active investigation into elder abuse and grand larceny. You have 20 minutes to gather personal essentials. Anything else will be considered trespassing." The collapse was total. Graham's tanned face turned a sickly shade of gray. He turned to me, his arrogance replaced by a pathetic, whining desperation. "Reese, baby, think about this. We've been married for 5 years. You can't just throw me out. I made a mistake with Bianca. Okay, it was the sun, the drinks. I'll end it right now. We can use the inheritance to fix everything." He actually moved to take my hand, but I stepped back, the revulsion I felt for him finally manifesting in my expression. "You didn't just betray me, Graham. You betrayed the soil. You tried to sell the heart of this valley while your father was gasping for air. You didn't marry a wife. You married an auditor, and your account is overdrawn." Bianca, realizing the multi-millionaire she had been entertaining was currently being evicted by the police, quietly slipped her designer shopping bags onto the floor and retreated toward the driveway, not looking back once. Elaine was on the verge of a hysterical breakdown, screaming about her rights and her furniture. "My furniture," she wailed. "That sofa cost $12,000. Patricia didn't even look up from her paperwork. "Actually, Elaine, that sofa was purchased with funds from the Vaughn corporate account, which you had no authority to use. It stays. Your personal clothing is in the laundry room. I suggest you move quickly." The scene was a chaotic blend of high-stakes drama and pathetic comedy. Graham was frantically checking his banking app only to find that every credit card had been declined and his access to the corporate funds had been severed. He was standing in a $5,000 suit with exactly $0 in his pocket. He began to threaten me, shouting that he would drag me through every court in California, that he would tell the world I was a fraud. "Go ahead, Graham," I said, pointing to the thick folders of evidence. "The press loves a story about a son who tried to kill his father for a cruise ship trip. I've already sent the audit reports to the district attorney's office. You won't be fighting for the house. You'll be fighting for a bunk in a cell." As the deputies escorted a sobbing Elaine and a cursing Graham toward the gate, the wind finally died down, leaving the estate in a sudden, heavy peace. They were left standing on the gravel road, surrounded by their duty-free shopping bags and the ruins of their greed. Graham looked back at the house, his eyes filled with a hollow realization. He had left a servant and returned to a queen. I walked to the front door and watched as the iron gate swung shut, the metallic clang sounding like the final period at the end of a long, painful sentence. The homecoming was over, and the house was finally truly ours. A month had passed since the storm of the homecoming had cleared, leaving Napa Valley in a state of tranquil, golden renewal. The early December sun was mild, casting a soft glow over the vines that were now entering their winter dormancy. I stood on the porch of the main house watching as a moving truck finally pulled away, carrying the last remnants of Elaine's designer furniture and Graham's hollow luxuries. They were gone, not just from the house, but from our lives. Patricia had informed me that Graham was currently facing a mountain of litigation for corporate fraud and elder abuse, while Elaine was living in a cramped one-bedroom apartment in the suburbs, complaining to anyone who would listen about the injustice of her lifestyle change. They had arrived with duty-free bags and left with nothing but the weight of their own choices. I turned back toward the house and saw Clara coming down the hallway. She wasn't wearing the gray maid's uniform anymore. Instead, she wore a vibrant blue silk dress that matched the color of the California sky. I had officially transferred the primary residence and a significant portion of the estate's shares into her name. After 20 years of being a shadow in her own home, she was finally the mistress of Vaughn Estates again. Seeing her sit at the head of the dining table, her hands no longer trembling as she poured tea, was a victory more valuable than any bank balance. We had reclaimed the soil, and in doing so, we had reclaimed our dignity. The sudden influx of distant relatives and old friends who had mysteriously appeared the moment the news of the trust broke was almost amusing. People who hadn't checked on my father or Remington in decades were now sending bouquets and sincere condolences. I handled them with a polite, sharp wit that Remington would have admired, reminding them that the Vaughn gates were now strictly for those who cared for the vines, not those who just wanted to drink the wine. It was a satisfying feeling being the gatekeeper of my own peace. Later that afternoon, I descended into the cellar one last time to settle a final debt. I carried with me the cream-colored envelope Graham had left on the console weeks ago, the note that had ordered me to be a servant while he toasted to his betrayal. I stood in front of the stone hearth where a small fire was crackling to take the chill off the cellar air. I reread his arrogant words one last time: "Be a good girl and mop the floors." I let out a short, cold laugh. Graham had intended for those words to be my shackles, but they had become the fuel for his own downfall. I dropped the note into the flames, watching as the paper curled and turned to ash. With it, the last of my resentment vanished into the chimney. I wasn't the boring wife anymore, and I certainly wasn't a victim. I was the architect of a new legacy. In accordance with Remington's final wishes and my own promise to the girl I used to be in the orphanage, I made a major decision regarding the northern acreage. Instead of selling it to global viticulture, I partitioned the land and sold a portion of the commercial rights to a local conservation group. The proceeds, amounting to several $1 million, were used to establish the Vaughn Foundation for Displaced Children. It was a sanctuary designed to provide education and legal support for orphans who, like me, had been cast out by the greed of others. I wanted to ensure that no child would ever have to fight for 20 years just to hear their own name spoken with respect. We weren't just growing grapes anymore. We were growing hope. As I walked back up to the northern ridge with my mother looking out over the valley that had seen so much pain and so much justice, I realized that the true harvest isn't measured in bottles or dollars. It's measured in the strength to stand up when everyone expects you to stay down. The Vaughn name was finally clean stripped of the rot that Remington and Graham had allowed to fester. We had proven that while greed can build an empire, only truth can sustain it. The soil was finally ours again, and for the first time in 20 years, the air tasted like freedom. The lesson of the Vaughn legacy: this journey has taught me a lesson that I hope stays with all of you. Justice is not something you wait for. It is something you build with your own two hands. In life, there will always be vultures like Graham and Elaine, people who see your kindness as a weakness and your silence as permission to take what isn't theirs. But remember, the invisible work you do, the integrity you keep, and the receipts you hold are the most powerful weapons in your arsenal. Never let someone who didn't plant the seeds tell you how to harvest the fruit. True power doesn't come from a title or a bank account. It comes from the courage to reclaim your life no matter how long it takes. Thank you so much for staying with me until the very end of this story. Your support has been the heartbeat of this journey, and I am deeply moved by the comments and stories you've shared about your own battles for justice. My favorite part of this whole experience was the moment Reese and her mother finally shared a toast in their own home, a simple act that represented 20 years of survival. If this story touched your heart or gave you strength, please give this video a like and subscribe to Revenge Blaze. Your interaction helps me continue to bring these powerful tales of family drama and ultimate justice to life. Please comment below and tell me, what was your favorite moment and what lesson will you take away today? Don't forget to share this story with someone who needs to be reminded that they are stronger than their circumstances. I wish you all health, luck, and the strength to always fight for what is rightfully yours. I'll see you in the next story. Stay tuned, something even more thrilling is coming soon.